The river was wild that morning, swollen with the restless melt of mountain snow, its voice a song of fury and freedom echoing through the valley. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a fragrance both cleansing and heavy with promise. He had not gone there to play the role of savior. His only intention had been to water the horses, to breathe in the silence of dawn before the weight of ranch work claimed him. Yet fate does not ask permission before altering the shape of a man's life. Out of the corner of his eye he glimpsed movement where no one should have been. A flash of fabric caught in the racing current, the pale hand of someone being swallowed whole. By the time thought had reached his mind, his body had already moved, plunging into the icy torrent, arms fighting against the relentless pull of the river. And when he broke the surface with her in his grip, coughing water and clinging to breath, he did not yet know that in saving her he had stepped into a story older than both their bloodlines. She lay on the grass, her dark hair clinging like ribbons of night across her face, her chest rising in ragged rhythm as the river water spilled from her lips. He pressed gently against her ribs, urging the stubborn spark of life to remain. Then, suddenly, her lashes trembled, and two eyes opened, deep, ancient, luminous with something he could not name. In that gaze there was no gratitude, no shock of a near-death salvation, only silence, profound enough to stir the soul. It was as though she had seen him before, in dreams or in another lifetime, and recognized what he did not. The morning sun broke through the trees then, laying its golden hands upon them both, warming skin still shivering from the river's chill, and in that light the valley itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that a thread of destiny had just been woven tighter. He thought she would rise, speak, perhaps whisper a trembling thank you before vanishing into the forest like any wanderer spared by mercy. Instead, she remained still, watching, a statue carved from devotion and mystery. That first day she followed him only with her eyes, but the next morning, when he opened his cabin door, there she was, 30 feet away, silent, unmoving, her gaze locked upon him with unshakable intent. The distance never changed, as though an invisible law bound her steps. To the market, to the fields, even to the quiet bend of the river where he had first found her, always 30 feet, never closer, never farther. At night he would check his doorstep and find eagle feathers left like prayers, first 1, then 2, then 3. A quiet ritual forming, an offering or a warning, he could not tell. Yet, beneath the strangeness, beneath the weight of superstition whispered by neighbors, he felt a subtle warmth each time her shadow trailed his. The presence of someone unseen yet always there had begun to soothe him in ways he dared not confess. The townsfolk whispered when they saw her, calling her a witch, a spirit, a curse. But in the quiet hours, when the world was only crickets and wind, he began to wonder if she was not instead a balm sent to heal an ache he hadn't realized lived inside him. There is something in being seen, wholly and unflinchingly, even at a distance. Her silence was not empty, but filled with a tenderness beyond language. And though he did not admit it aloud, he found comfort in waking each morning to the certainty of her presence, to the soft reminder that in the vast loneliness of the valley, he was no longer entirely alone. The river had not only given him the chance to save a life, it had delivered him a soul who carried secrets that both unsettled and steadied his heart. Every story begins with a single breath, a single moment that transforms everything. For him, It was the shock of cold water, the desperate pull against a merciless current, the weight of another life held in his arms. For her, it was the act of being pulled from the embrace of death and placed back into a world she had not chosen to rejoin. Between them stretched a thread woven by hands neither could see, but both could feel. And as days folded into nights, and nights into more mornings with her waiting at that measured distance, he began to understand that sometimes healing does not come in gentle words or warm embraces, but in the steady gaze of someone who refuses to let you walk unseen. Perhaps that is why you, dear listener, have felt your own spirit drawn into this tale, because within it lies a quiet medicine for the heart, a whisper that destiny often arrives clothed in mystery, that love is born not always in laughter or touch, but in silence, in patience, in the simple act of being there. If this story soothes you, if it brings even a flicker of healing warmth to your evening, or softens the weight of your day, then let your heart leave its trace. Like, share, or leave your words in the comments so that this circle of stories may continue flowing like the river itself. And if you wish to walk further with us into valleys of romance and echoes of fate, subscribe, for each story is a step deeper into the quiet beauty of love's unfolding. The river is only just beginning to speak, and its current carries us forward. Let us follow where it leads. For 17 days she remained, always at that unbreakable distance, always with the same unwavering eyes. He had tried to cross the space between them once, curious, aching for some fragment of explanation. But the moment his boots shifted forward, hers moved back. Step for step, retreat for advance, as if the earth itself measured the boundary between them. That 30 feet was more than distance. It was a rule, a law etched into her very being, a fragile balance he did not yet dare to shatter. She seemed bound not by fear, but by some invisible tether, and the mystery of it pressed against his thoughts late into the night, keeping sleep at bay and dreams restless with questions. Neighbors grew uneasy. Mrs. Patterson at the general store crossed herself each time she glimpsed the Apache girl trailing him, whispering of curses and omens. Old Henrik muttered that nothing in this world comes without reason, that a girl shadowing him so faithfully meant she was guarding something, or binding him to something he could not yet name. Their fear became a mirror, showing him possibilities darker than he wished to consider. Yet, when he turned to see her figure, framed by cottonwoods and horizon, he felt no dread. He felt steadiness, like the hush of healing water flowing unseen beneath the earth. There was no menace in her watchfulness, only a silence vast enough to hold him, as though she had become the keeper of a truth too weighty for words. One evening, when the sun lay low and the valley shimmered in a bath of copper light, he found another feather placed upon the fence rail, black-tipped, smooth, perfect. It was the fourth, and when he lifted it gently between his fingers, she tilted her head, a small motion, but the first shift he had seen in weeks. For a heartbeat, he thought she might step forward, break her stillness, speak. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward the river. No voice, no command, only that steady gesture, her arm extended with the gravity of ritual. He understood nothing, and yet something in the marrow of his bones told him to obey. The river was swollen now, its waters frothing with restless energy. There upon its banks lay a spiral of stones, arranged with deliberate care, curling inward to the place where the current bit deepest. It was no accident, no child's game of balance and stacking. It was a pattern woven with intent, like a message waiting to be read by eyes that did not yet know the language. She stepped close then, shattering the sacred gap. Bare feet touched the first stone of the spiral, her hand pressed against the largest rock at the center. And with a voice that carried the gravity of centuries, she spoke her first words in 17 days. "You saved wrong person." The sound of her voice struck through him like the cold bite of river water. Wrong person. The words clawed at his understanding, unraveling the certainty that had anchored his memory of that morning rescue. He had pulled her from death's hands, felt her heart stutter back into rhythm beneath his palms. How could it be wrong? Yet her eyes shimmered with fear, not of him, but of something older, heavier, hidden beneath the stones and the feathers. When she whispered again, softer, almost breaking with sorrow, "Now the debt follows you." A chill rippled through him, deeper than any mountain current. That night he sat awake in the silence of his cabin, the feathers heavy in his pocket, the memory of her words heavier still. Debt. The notion gnawed at him, strange and haunting. His grandfather's name surfaced in the stories he half remembered, tales of a woman pulled from the river generations ago, a woman who should have perished but had not. Was this the echo of that old act? A healing turned curse, a kindness turned binding chain. He stared into the fire until the embers collapsed into ash, yet no answer came. Only her presence remained, steadfast as the stars, 30 feet away beyond the cabin door, a sentinel of fate he had not chosen yet, could not refuse. Morning brought no relief. She stood there again, silent as dawn, her gaze weaving through him like threads of an unseen tapestry. He tried to bury himself in work, mending fences, tending to the horses, buying grain in town, yet everywhere he went, her shadow lay upon him like a second heartbeat. And though the townsfolk muttered, though their eyes judged, he could not deny the strange comfort of her constancy. For in her quiet there was something healing, something that smoothed the raw edges of his solitude. It was as if she held not only her own secrets, but also the fragments of his loneliness, carrying them wordlessly so that he no longer bore them alone. One evening, as dusk stretched its violet veil over the land, he followed her gaze back to the river, to the spiral of stones that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. He thought of the eagle feathers, of her words, of the debt that bound unseen generations. The river whispered to him in a tongue older than his lineage, its rushing song weaving with the steady rhythm of her silence. And in that quiet convergence of water, feather, and stone, he felt it, an invisible current pulling him deeper into her world, into the mystery of her presence, into a story far greater than his own. The spiral was not yet finished, and neither was the thread between them. What had begun as a rescue was unfolding into something more, a bond neither of them had chosen, yet both of them felt, trembling beneath the skin like the breath of destiny itself. And as he stood beneath the twilight sky, the wind cool and cleansing against his face, he knew the river had given him more than a life to save. It had given him a path he could no longer turn away from. The debt was only the beginning. The heart had already begun to follow. The whispers of the valley grew sharper with each passing day. What had begun as muttered words in the general store turned into open suspicion, eyes narrowing when he walked into town, glances darting toward the silent figure who trailed him at her exact distance. They called her names she did not deserve: witch, omen, shadow of misfortune. When cattle sickened from poor feed, they blamed her. When wells ran dry beneath the heat of an unkind sky, they said her presence had soured the earth. The more the valley suffered, the heavier their suspicion grew, until fear wrapped around them all like a tightening rope. He bore their judgment quietly at first, telling himself it would pass as surely as storms passed over the ridges. Yet the storm lingered, and the weight of it pressed upon his chest. He found himself defending her in ways that surprised him, reminding neighbors that drought had long been part of their lives, that sickness struck herds before she ever appeared. But words fall powerless against fear, and fear spread like fire through dry grass. He began to notice the way torches lingered too long on porches at night, the way men whispered together when they thought he wasn't near. The valley had turned its gaze upon him too, for by saving her he had bound himself to whatever shadow they believed she carried. And still she watched. Still she remained 30 feet behind, silent but steadfast, a figure both fragile and unyielding, her dark eyes carrying the weight of something he could not yet see. He wondered if she felt the sharp edge of their fear, if she heard their whispered curses. Yet she never flinched, never left, never let the rope of distance between them break. That constancy, unmoving, unshaken, was not a chain as they imagined, but something else entirely. It was healing, a strange kind of quiet medicine that wrapped around him when the world grew heavy. In her presence, even in silence, he felt steadier, less alone. And slowly, unknowingly, affection began to take root. One afternoon, while he carried supplies from the store, she spoke again, her voice soft yet strong, like the low hum of wind through canyon stone. "You ask wrong questions," she said, her accent shaping each syllable with grace. "Then tell me the right ones," he urged, desperate for even a sliver of understanding. She shook her head gently. "You cannot ask. You must see." Then she turned, her moccasins whispering against the dirt road, leading not toward the river this time, but up the long-forgotten mining trail. He followed, not because he understood, but because something inside him had already surrendered to the pull of her mystery. The trail twisted upward into foothills, kissed by fading sunlight. There, she guided him to a weathered cabin, its door scarred by age and carved letters, Maria Santos, 1847. Below the name, fresher cuts read, "She was supposed to drown." His breath caught as her story unfolded, how a woman long ago had walked into the river to join her lost child, but had been pulled out by his own grandfather. That act of saving meant to heal had broken a balance older than his bloodline. Maria Santos had lived, and because of that, generations had followed who were never meant to exist, including Ayana herself. The truth crashed over him like the river's current, colder than the water that had nearly claimed her weeks before. His grandfather's mercy had not only changed a life, it had changed destinies, binding their families together in a web of debt that deepened with each generation. He looked at Ayana then, really looked, and realized she was not only a girl he had saved, but the embodiment of a story carried across time, across blood, across grief and survival. "So, when I saved you..." His voice broke, but she finished the thought with solemn eyes. "You saved someone who should not exist. You made the debt stronger. In that moment, the distance between them felt more crushing than ever. 30 feet became a chasm carved by history itself. He wanted to cross it, to take her hand, to tell her that fate could be rewritten, that she was not a mistake, but a gift. But she pulled back even as he inched forward, whispering, "Cannot touch." Makes binding stronger. Her restraint only deepened his yearning. She was bound to him by laws unseen, and yet he had begun to feel bound to her by something far simpler, far more powerful. The quiet ache of love. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the sound of horses thundered from below, voices rising with anger, torches flaring like restless stars. The townsfolk had come, fear burning brighter than reason, ready to sever what they could not comprehend. "They come for you," she said, her voice urgent yet calm, "because they think I am a curse." He turned, heart pounding with both fear and clarity. He could let them take her, let their fear win, or he could stand against the tide, choosing her not out of obligation, but out of devotion. He did not yet speak the words aloud, but inside the choice was already made. The healing presence of her silence, the steadiness of her gaze, the truth that her existence carried, these had already carved their way into his heart. The river had not given him a burden. It had given him a companion carved by fate, fragile and fierce, whose presence was already teaching him that love is not always born in laughter or touch, but sometimes in the stillness of someone who simply refuses to leave. And as the torches glowed brighter in the valley below, he knew the story was carrying them both toward a moment when hearts would be forced to speak, no matter the cost. The night burned with the glow of torches, their light flickering across the valley like restless fireflies stirred by anger. Voices rose against the stillness of the hills, carrying threats, suspicion, and the brittle edge of fear sharpened into hatred. He could see them moving between the trees, shadows of men he had known for years, neighbors who had shared meals at his table, men he had worked alongside during harvest and drought. Now those same faces were twisted by superstition, convinced that the girl at his constant distance was not flesh and blood, but curse and ruin. Ayana stood 30 feet behind him, as always, her figure poised, her gaze steady, though he caught the faint flicker of weariness in her eyes. She had endured the weight of their whispers in silence, and now she would face their fury the same way, unflinching, calm, as though she had long prepared for this moment. "They fear me," she said softly, the words barely reaching him through the wind. "But fear is not truth. Fear is only shadow." Her voice, though low, carried a healing cadence, a note of strength that steadied him as surely as a hand upon his shoulder. He turned to face the crowd as they drew near, Henrik Larsson at the front, his rifle glinting in torchlight, Mrs. Patterson clutching her shawl like a shield. They shouted accusations, "Witch, curse, bringer of drought." Their voices tangled with the crackle of flames until it seemed the night itself was against him. Yet when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice did not falter. "She is no curse," he said, firm and clear. "She follows because of a debt older than any of us here, a debt my family carries." His words hung heavy in the air, but suspicion thickened instead of easing. Henrik spat into the dirt. "Then your family's debt has cursed us all." Ayana stepped forward then, closing the sacred distance for only the second time that day. The crowd fell silent at the boldness of her motion, their torches wavering. "There is a way to break it," she announced, her voice clear as the river's song. "A way to end what binds us." Eyes turned to her, curiosity wrestling with mistrust. She did not flinch beneath their scrutiny. "Equal saving for equal saving. He pulled me from the river when I should have drowned. Tomorrow I go back to the water. He saves me again, or he does not. If he does, the debt is broken. If he does not, then it ends another way." The crowd murmured, their anger dulled by the simplicity of her offering. Even Henrik, though unconvinced, lowered his weapon slightly. The logic was undeniable. One act of balance to close the circle of fate. She returned to her place behind him, 30 feet once more, her dark eyes meeting his with a depth that pierced him. There was no fear in them, only resolve, and something else he could no longer ignore, trust. She was willing to risk herself, willing to cast her life into the current again, so that he might be free. His chest ached with the weight of it, with the quiet tenderness he had not wanted to name. That night, the valley hummed with restless anticipation. In his cabin he could not sleep, haunted by the image of her slender form slipping beneath the dark river, her life depending on his arms once more. He thought of her voice, its soothing rhythm, its healing strength, and realized he could not bear the thought of it silenced forever. He stepped outside and found her in her usual place, her silhouette silvered by moonlight. She looked at him, and for the first time the space between them felt unbearable. He longed to cross it, to take her hand, to whisper that she was not burden, not curse, but blessing. But her words lingered. Cannot touch, makes binding stronger. So he held his place, though his heart leaned toward her with every beat. Dawn rose grey and trembling, mist curling above the river like spirits of the night reluctant to leave. The townsfolk gathered on the banks, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the water that churned with snowmelt. Beside him stood Joseph Running Bear, Ayana's father, solemn and weathered, carrying the dignity of generations. He laid eagle feathers upon the ground, their tips catching the weak light of morning. 4 feathers for 4 generations, he said, his voice heavy with both sorrow and reverence. Maria Santos, her daughter, her granddaughter, Ayana. Today, the river decides. Ayana stepped forward then, not 30 feet away, not bound by silence, but free in her choice. She looked at him, and in her gaze he saw no compulsion, no ancient debt, only the quiet power of decision. "After today," she said, her voice warm despite the chill, "no more following, no more chains, only choice." She touched the hem of her dress, then walked into the river. The current seized her instantly, pulling her downstream with merciless force. She did not fight at first, letting herself be carried, her body surrendering to the water's will. At the count of 5, she disappeared beneath the surface. At the count of 8, she had not returned. His chest seized with panic, and he dove without waiting for 10. The water struck him like a wall of ice, cutting breath from his lungs. He swam hard, each stroke burning, his eyes searching for her shadow in the chaos of current. There, dark hair flashing near submerged rocks. He reached her just as her strength faltered, wrapping his arm around her chest, pulling her against him. She gasped, coughed, her eyes wide with fear more real than ritual. For the first time, he felt her grip on him, desperate and human, her hand clutching at his shirt as though she, too, feared the river's hunger. He kicked against the torrent, his muscles screaming, his breath shallow, until at last his feet found stone. He hauled her onto the bank, both of them trembling, drenched, but alive. Joseph Running Bear's voice rang out across the hushed crowd. Debt is balanced, equal saving for equal saving. It is finished. He scattered the feathers into the current, and they drifted away, carried by the same water that had once bound them. The people, silent and shaken, began to disperse. Henrik lowered his gaze. Mrs. Patterson crossed herself once more, but this time with relief rather than suspicion. The air, heavy with fear for so long, seemed to ease. Ayana rose slowly, her dress clinging, her dark hair plastered to her skin. She stood not 30 feet away, not bound, but directly before him. Her hand lifted, trembling not with obligation, but with choice, and she brushed her fingers gently along his jaw. Her touch was soft, healing, tender as morning light upon frost. "No more following," she whispered, "only what we choose." The words warmed him more than any fire could, and as the river whispered its eternal song beside them, he understood that though the debt was broken, something far greater had just begun. 3 months later, smoke rose from her chimney on the hillside, a quiet sign of her presence. He could see her house from his kitchen window, and when she came down the path to visit, it was not with silence 30 feet behind, but with a smile that carried warmth, like sunlight after storm. She was no longer bound by fate, and neither was he. What tied them now was something softer, something chosen, something healing. It was love, born not from obligation, but from the steady gaze of two souls who had walked through river and fire and found each other on the other side. The days that followed the breaking of the debt unfolded like petals in spring, slow, deliberate, full of quiet wonder. Where once there had been distance, there was now presence. Where silence had been heavy, it became gentle, like a song humming beneath the breath of life. He no longer woke to find her 30 feet away, still as stone and bound by law unseen. Instead, he woke to the soft knowledge that she might arrive by choice, her footsteps upon the path leading down from the hillside where her cabin smoked against the morning sky. That knowledge filled his heart with warmth deeper than sunlight, a healing calm that seeped into the cracks left by years of solitude. He began to notice the small things, the little miracles that love plants quietly in the soil of a man's heart. The way her laughter, rare but radiant, sounded like water striking smooth stones in the creek. The way she carried herbs from the hills, laying them across his table, their fragrance rising with promises of healing. The way her hair caught the gold of evening light, strands glowing as though kissed by fire. Each detail became sacred, stored within him as carefully as one might guard treasures of the earth. And though she had spoken the words clearly, no more following, only choosing, he realized that his soul now followed her in ways deeper than steps or shadows could measure. Life in the valley, once restless with suspicion, began to soften too. The people, having witnessed the river's judgment, no longer spat curses when they saw her. Some nodded stiffly in greeting, others offered wary smiles. Children, curious and braver than their parents, lingered near her with wide eyes as she passed through town. She never forced herself upon them, never demanded acceptance, but her quiet strength began to soothe even the most stubborn hearts. Healing, he realized, was not always sudden. Sometimes it came like slow rain, patient and steady, washing away fear grain by grain until the earth softened again. Together, they worked as though their lives had always been entwined. She brought knowledge of herbs and weather, teaching him which plants eased fever, which roots calmed aching bones, which clouds spoke of rain. He showed her the rhythm of ranch life, how to mend fences, how to coax stubborn cattle, how to listen for the earth's subtle signs of change. In the joining of their worlds, something new blossomed, neither Apache nor settler, but something woven from both, a tapestry strong with choice rather than obligation. It was in this weaving that he understood love most clearly, not as fire that consumes, but as steady warmth that endures, as healing presence that asks nothing yet gives everything. Evenings became their sacred time. They would sit upon the porch as the sky faded into violet and gold, her shoulder near his, though never needing to press against it, her presence enough to quiet the storms that once raged in him. Sometimes she told stories, fragments of her people, of spirits that guarded rivers and mountains, of songs carried by wind. Other times silence stretched between them, yet it was not empty but full, like the hush of a chapel. In that silence his heart learned what it meant to be seen, not for what he had done, not for debts carried or repaid, but for the man he was when all burdens were laid down. One evening, as the stars climbed the darkening sky, she turned to him with eyes luminous as the river in moonlight. "When you pulled me from the water," she said softly, "I thought you had changed my fate, but now I see. You gave me the chance to choose it myself." The words sank into him like seeds into fertile ground, and he felt tears press at the edges of his vision. For so long he had thought of that day as a binding, as the weight of a curse passed down. But in her voice, in the gentle, healing tone of her truth, he finally understood. It was not a burden, but a beginning. Seasons shifted. Winter laid its pale blanket across the valley, and still she came, carrying warmth into the coldest nights. And he would wake to find her firelight glowing on the hillside, a beacon of comfort against the dark. And in spring, when blossoms burst from stubborn branches, she wove flowers into garlands and set them upon his table with a smile that needed no words. Every season carried its own tenderness, its own reminder that love, when chosen, is as enduring as the earth itself. The memory of torches, of suspicion, of whispered names faded slowly, but it no longer ruled them. What remained instead was a bond woven through healing and choice, a love born not of debt or destiny, but of freedom. And as he watched her move through the meadow one morning, her dress catching the wind like a banner of light, he knew with absolute certainty that the river had not cursed him. It had given him the greatest gift. Not salvation from solitude, not freedom from obligation, but the living, breathing presence of a woman who had become his heart's true home. And so, as the valley healed from its fears, as the people learned acceptance and the seasons turned with their eternal rhythm, he walked beside her not as savior, not as debtor, but as beloved. The past lay behind them like the river's old stones, shaped by current and time. What flowed before them now was choice, warm as morning light, endless as the horizon. Their story was no longer bound by fear or fate. It was bound only by love, steady and healing, carrying them into every tomorrow together. The hillside where her cabin stood became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a sanctuary where the air seemed clearer, the light softer, the hours more forgiving. From his kitchen window he would watch the smoke curl upward from her chimney, rising in gentle spirals that looked like prayers written against the sky. Sometimes she would walk down the slope with a basket of herbs or berries, her stride steady, her presence a calm rhythm woven into his days. Other times he climbed to her door, finding her sitting on the porch with her hair loose, weaving strands of grass absent-mindedly, her eyes carrying the stillness of mountains. In those moments the world itself seemed to pause, as though it too sought healing in her nearness. Together they built a life not hurried but intentional, every gesture layered with meaning. When she stirred roots into a pot over the fire, he listened to the cadence of her stories, whispers of rivers that remembered every soul who entered them, of stars that kept watch over wandering hearts. Her voice, low and warm, folded around him like a quilt on a winter night. He, in turn, taught her the rhythm of his world, how to ride across the fields at dawn when mist kissed the grass, how to mend a saddle, how to call the cattle with a whistle that carried across the hills. Their days became an exchange of gifts, not demanded but freely offered, a weaving of two lives into one fabric stronger than either could have been alone. The people of the valley, once hardened by suspicion, began to soften in ways small but undeniable. Mrs. Patterson, who had once crossed herself at the sight of Ayana, came to her for remedies when her joints ached. Henrik, who had raised his rifle, nodded stiffly when he passed them in town, his eyes no longer aflame with judgment. Children came openly now, gathering near her cabin to listen as she pointed out the shapes of animals in the clouds or taught them which plants were safe to taste. The same valley that had burned with fear began slowly to breathe in her healing presence. The wound between her people and his had not vanished, but it had begun to close, stitch by quiet stitch. In the evenings, when work was done and the valley hushed beneath its blanket of stars, they sat side by side with the night stretched before them like an open book. Sometimes he would reach for his guitar, fingers stumbling across strings, and she would smile, her head tilted to catch every note as though the music were a blessing poured into her. Sometimes she would hum in return, soft melodies that carried echoes of ancient chants, her voice mingling with the wind until it seemed the whole world listened. In those moments, he realized that love is not always grand declaration or fiery embrace. It is the ease of being, the healing quiet of knowing another soul shares your silence and turns it into music. The river remained a presence in their lives, not feared but honored. Often they walked its banks together, the sound of water weaving with their steps, the memory of what had bound them now transformed into something sacred. He no longer looked at the current with dread but with reverence, understanding that it had not been an enemy but a teacher. The river had carried them into one another's arms, had tested their strength, had cleansed the debts of generations. Now its song felt like a benediction, a promise that what was once wound could become healing. With time, his heart softened in ways he had not thought possible. The man who once lived within fences of duty and solitude now found himself dreaming beyond them. He imagined fields shared, winters endured not in silence but in warmth, children running barefoot through the meadows, their laughter rising like birds. He never spoke these dreams aloud at first, fearing they might be too fragile, but she seemed to sense them anyway. Sometimes she would glance at him with a quiet smile, her dark eyes carrying an unspoken answer, as though she too had seen the same visions in the firelight of her mind. There was a night when the valley was washed in silver light, the moon full and kind, the air scented with wild sage. They sat close, her hand resting lightly on the porch rail between them, and he felt the distance that once divided them dissolve into something tender, something chosen. Turning to him, her voice a whisper of healing wind, she said, "Love is not debt. Love is not fear. Love is the freedom to stay when nothing forces you." Her words entered him like light into shadow, filling spaces he had long kept hidden. He reached then, not with desperation, but with reverence, and when her hand met his, it was not binding, but release. Seasons shifted again, carrying with them the steady rhythm of their shared life. Spring returned with blossoms that spread like hope across the valley. Summer ripened fields into gold. Autumn painted the hills in fire, and winter returned with its soft hush. Through it all their love deepened, not in sudden bursts, but in quiet accumulation, each moment adding to the next, until the very air around them seemed infused with warmth. He no longer thought of curses or debts, no longer carried the weight of stories whispered in fear. What filled him instead was the healing certainty that the river had given him more than survival. It had given him her, and in her a love vast enough to heal the wounds of time itself. And so, as the river kept flowing and the valley kept turning through its seasons, they walked together into every dawn and every dusk, no longer strangers bound by obligation, but lovers bound only by choice. The world around them softened because they had softened, healed because they had healed, and every day became proof that sometimes destiny is not a chain but a gift. Sometimes the river does not take, it delivers. And what it had delivered to them was not debt, not curse, but a love strong enough to light the hills, warm enough to outlast winter, healing enough to carry them into forever. The morning after the river had tested them both, when her life slipped through his arms and then returned with a gasp of air, something unspoken changed forever between them. No longer did they stand divided by 30 feet of silence, nor by the whispers of the town, nor by the debts of generations past. What had been weight became release, what had been obligation became freedom. She stood before him now, not because she was bound, but because she wished to, her presence no longer the shadow of an ancient law, but the light of a choice made freely. That difference was everything. It was healing, it was warmth, it was love reborn in its truest form. The days that followed carried the texture of renewal. She visited his home without hesitation, stepping across the threshold not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. She touched the worn wood of his table, added sprigs of herbs in jars upon his shelves, and her laughter, soft, rare, and utterly radiant, filled the empty corners of rooms that had once echoed only with silence. He found himself watching her in quiet awe, not because of the strangeness that had once clung to her presence, but because of the gentleness she carried into every space. She was not only a woman who had endured suspicion and curses, but a woman who turned heaviness into healing, who taught him that even wounds written in stone could soften when touched by love. The valley still whispered, but its tone shifted. Where once torches had burned and rifles had been raised, Now the people's eyes began to open with hesitant curiosity. They had seen her risk her life before their gaze, had seen him dive into the water with devotion burning brighter than fear, had seen the feathers carried away by the river, ending the chain of debt. Something in that act had cracked the hardness around their hearts. It did not transform them all at once, but even Henrik's stare lost its venom, and Mrs. Patterson, who once crossed herself, now sent bread with her blessings. Healing moved slowly, but it moved, carried by her constancy and his unwavering defense. Together, they built something stronger than walls of wood or fences of stone. They built a bond rooted in choice, in small daily acts of devotion. He taught her the language of his ranch, the way to guide cattle across the meadow, the way to mend a broken saddle, the way to listen for the storm hidden in the wind. She, in return, shared her wisdom of the earth, the leaves that soothed fever, the flowers that whispered of rain, the rituals that honored the river not as curse, but as giver of life. In those exchanges, their worlds ceased to be separate threads. They wove together into a tapestry, both tender and enduring. There were nights when they walked along the riverbank, their hands brushing, the moon reflecting silver on the restless current. Where once he had feared its hunger, now he saw only its lessons, that survival is not enough, that healing requires surrender, that love is not in defying the current, but in learning to flow with it. And as they stood there, the water's song filling the valley, he realized that every fear had been worth it, every whisper, every battle, because it had brought him to her, to this moment where love stood unbound. Her father, Joseph Running Bear, visited often, bringing with him the solemn grace of a man who had carried the weight of generations. Yet even he softened as he watched them, his stern eyes warming when Ayana laughed, his silence approving when he saw how gently she was cherished. "The river gave her back to you," he said once, his voice like wind through stone. "Do not waste the gift." And he did not. Every day he woke with gratitude, knowing that love was not owed to him but offered, knowing that her presence was not a debt but a blessing. As months passed, her cabin on the hillside glowed with life. He would see the smoke rise each morning and know she was there, weaving her world into his. Sometimes she came down the path with herbs, sometimes simply to sit with him as the sun set over the valley. Other times he climbed to her door, carrying firewood, his hands brushing hers as they stacked it together, both smiling in the quiet understanding that no words were needed. Their love was not loud, not urgent, it was steady, like the heartbeat of the earth, like the flow of the river, like the turning of seasons that promised renewal again and again. And as the valley healed from its shadows, so too did their hearts. No longer bound by fear, no longer burdened by fate, they walked together into the tender unknown of what was yet to come. Their love was no longer born of rescue or debt. It was born of freedom, of two souls choosing again and again to remain. It was love that healed, love that warmed, love that carried them gently forward, step by step, toward the horizon that waited with open arms. The years stretched out like golden fields beneath the sun, their love weaving itself into every season, every rhythm of life in the valley. Where once there had been silence, heavy with suspicion, there was now laughter, gentle voices, the hum of days lived side by side. His ranch no longer felt like a fortress of solitude, but like a sanctuary warmed by her presence. The cabin she had built on the hillside stood as a testament not to distance but to choice, her lamp glowing each evening like a star guiding him home. Together they created a world where duty and debt were forgotten, where love was not a chain but a garden, tended each day with tenderness, watered with trust, and blooming with healing warmth. The river, once feared for its power and the secrets it carried, became their sacred place. They walked its banks often, hand in hand now, no longer bound by invisible laws, but bound by devotion freely chosen. The spiral of stones that had once terrified him with mystery was now a circle of memory, a place where they left flowers, feathers, and whispers of gratitude. The current no longer reminded him of curses or debts. It reminded him of renewal, of the way love itself flows, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, but always carrying life forward. And in the sound of that endless water they heard their own story echoed, a tale of rescue that became destiny, of silence that became love, of wounds that found healing in the arms of time. The people of the valley changed with them. Where once fear had hardened their eyes, now respect softened them. Mrs. Patterson still carried her shawl, but her visits were filled with warmth, her voice gentler as she sought Ayana's remedies for small aches. Henrik, once furious and blind with superstition, came quietly one autumn to ask for help when his grandson grew sick. She healed without judgment, her hands steady, her eyes tender, and when the boy's fever broke, Henrik bowed his head for the first time in humility. The valley, healed by her presence, began to understand that love is not danger, but medicine, not curse, but blessing. Through her, they learned what he had known for years, that healing does not only live in herbs or prayers, but in compassion, in choosing kindness where once there had been fear. Their evenings became poems written in starlight. On her porch, they sat side by side, her head resting gently against his shoulder, his arm wrapped loosely around her, the world hushed into reverence. Sometimes he played his guitar, soft chords weaving with the night wind, while she hummed melodies that had been passed down through generations of her people. The music rose like smoke into the sky, carrying not only sound, but memory, love, and promise. And when silence fell, it was not heavy as before. It was healing silence, alive with everything unspoken, yet understood. The kind of silence that tells two souls they are no longer alone, that every breath is shared, every heartbeat answered. He often thought of the day he had pulled her from the river, the cold water biting his skin, the fear pressing against his chest. That moment, once heavy with confusion, now shone like the brightest thread in his memory. It had not been the beginning of a curse, as the valley once believed, but the beginning of salvation, not hers alone, but his as well. For he had been drowning long before that day, drowning in loneliness, in burdens carried too long. Saving her had in truth saved him, drawing him into a life filled with warmth and presence, a life no longer haunted by shadows of silence. And so the years flowed with grace, each one carrying them deeper into love's embrace. Their story became part of the land itself, whispered by the river, remembered by the stones, honored by the wind. It was not a tale of chains, but of freedom, not of fear, but of courage, not of debt, but of devotion. It was the proof that love heals even the oldest wounds, that choice is stronger than fate, that when two souls meet in truth, they can rewrite the very laws that once bound them. If this story touched your heart, if it brought you even a moment of warmth or a sense of healing peace, let your presence be known. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so that more stories like this can find their way to you. Every gesture helps keep these tales alive, carrying their light into other hearts that might be waiting just as you were. And as you do, may love itself walk beside you, steady as the river, healing as the dawn, endless as the sky.